everyone. Thank you for coming to join me. Our topic is going to be the Apple Sandbox, as we said, and sorry. And this is basically one of, I think, the most important aspects of macOS and iOS both, which has been around for a very long time. In fact, it's been introduced back in macOS 10.5, which is all the way when it was known as Seatbelt. And over time, there's been a history of many bypasses to this, and Apple has learned again and again and improved again and again the many implementations have been, in fact, been revised several times, and there's been very little research on the subject, barring maybe one very nice presentation and talk by one Dionysius Balazakis, but that was over 5 years ago. So I figured that with all these profound changes, it's time to maybe revisit this, and also this is within the context of a new book that's coming out by myself on iOS and macOS in the context of securities and insecurity. And so we're going to discuss this, and we're going to look at the implementation from an historical perspective, starting from the very, very first implementations, which, as I said, were very naive back in macOS 10.5. And we can see that the sandbox is evolving constantly, but just by looking at its source version. Apple maintains a versioning of all of its source bases. And you can see that off of the LC source version command, looking at the kext, looking at the various libraries. And we actually see that on occasion, with every new release of macOS and iOS, the number pops up by about 100, 120 releases. So we see this is being actively developed and, in fact, is undergoing profound changes even as we speak. Just in the iOS 10 betas, there have been some changes from version 570 all the way to the present day 592. And it seems that for now it's stabilized, and what I'm going to be trying to cover is all the latest and greatest changes up till that very version. Now, why are we here? So, as I said, I personally think this is very, very important, and fact of the matter is, you do too. 8 people did vote me in, so I guess those 8 people are somewhere in the audience here, so thank you. And basically the idea is that we're going to look at this because from the perspective of security, both in macOS and in iOS, this is really the fundamental line, the fundamental border, where if you look at it from a trust boundary perspective, oftentimes if you break out of the sandbox, pretty much the way to root is just paved for you. Primarily, we see that in jailbreaks, where jailbreaks consist of many, many sequences of exploits or things we have to get just right in order to get that much coveted jailbreak active. But really, the very first stage, if you discount code signing, which nowadays anybody can do with an Apple certificate, the very first stage is to break out of the container, to break out of the sandbox. And also, we see that in macOS as well, with the advent of SIP, what they call System Integrity Protection. This is a new feature they put in macOS 10.11 later, which is, in fact, nothing more than a glorified sandbox profile that's applied platform-wide. Now, our plan of attack is going to be, first of all, to give you a little bit of the basics. I'm not sure how many of you guys here are familiar with macOS and iOS. Can I get a show of hands? How many people here are, active macOS users or iOS users? Not that many, actually. So for the benefit of those of you who aren't maybe all too familiar, I will show some of the what I call prerequisites. And primarily, this is what they call the MAC-F, which is the Mandatory Access Control Framework, which is in fact a substrate on top of which all of Apple's security mechanisms, including code signing, sandboxing, Apple mobile file integrity, everything is built on top of that. So first I'll be explaining that, and then I'll diverge into 2 different implementations. The first implementation is the macOS, where they call it App Sandboxing. The second one is the Star OS, and I use Star OS because traditionally I've used that to anything that is not macOS X. Craig Federighi kind of ruined it for me when he took out the X, and now Star OS kind of covers macOS too. So ignore that. When you see Star OS, it's basically anything but macOS. Doing that in a regular expression would have been too difficult. So basically the idea is that I'll show the implementation on iOS, watchOS, tvOS, which is all essentially the same. And the idea there, a fundamental idea, is called a container. And then following that, I'll try and show you a little bit of how I dug into the sandbox and pretty much got to reverse the entire implementation. And once again, I'll diverge to the macOS version, which is fairly easy because it is symbolicated, and the iOS version, which unfortunately it is not. Lastly, I'll show some sandbox APIs, which are present in user mode, but needless to say are entirely undocumented. And so I'll try to show you these APIs both from the perspective of how you could use them, but also with a couple of tools that I've provided for this approach. And also, you're welcome to follow this along. If you go to this URL right here, which is New OS X book. That's where I publish my books through. And so if you go to that, there's a particular section for articles. A lot of these articles are like extra stuff that didn't make it in the first edition of the book, and a lot of addenda and a lot of like extra material. And so I just put in an article here, which is HITSB, hackintosandbox.html. And if you go there, you'll see that there's both a presentation that you can follow along with, as well as all sorts of miscellaneous tools. And hopefully, if the internet cooperates here, because it's been giving me a hard time today, then you should be seeing that there's a PDF and then a bunch of sources. I've made all of my research entirely open source. You can go on and get some reverse engineered sources, as well as companion files for the kernel extension if you're going to do some reversing yourself, as well as the various binaries. So with all that in mind, let's get started. So, as I said, we're going to start off with something called the MAC-F. Now, the MAC-F is the Mandatory Access Control Framework. First of all, just for the verbiage, mandatory access control versus discretionary access control. Discretionary access control, what you call DAC usually, is the traditional model in Unix, where we give users the ability to change and to apply permissions on various objects in the file system primarily. And that would be the usual chmod, chown, chgrep that you all know and love. Basically, you get the idea, you get the discretion of whether or not to apply permissions on a particular object. By comparison, mandatory access control, MAC, or MAC-F for the Mandatory Access Control Framework, is this idea where we say it's not discretionary anymore, it's mandatory. Meaning that we do all types of access control, permissions primarily, and user rights assignments, but we do that on a system-wide basis where essentially only the administrator can assign those permissions and everybody has to abide by them. Now, Apple takes that one level upwards of that, and that is to say that they are the true administrator of the operating system. And then if you're running iOS, obviously you're just kind of like leasing the device from them, and they decide whatever the policy should be, and you have no control over the matter. And we see that slowly creeping into macOS with the advent of SIP that I've mentioned, System Integrity Protection, which is what they call rootless, which is really the idea that root is still there, but it's not root anymore, it's a lot less. Root can do less. Many people thought that Apple would remove the root prompt entirely. They can't do that because too many people need the power user experience. But then on the other hand, they do have the consistent ability to remove a lot of root's capabilities and root's powers, and that is effectively what rootless is. And we see that starting in macOS 10.11, and unfortunately getting even stronger in 10.12. Now, for those of you coming from Android, as I've seen many Android people here, the idea is primarily also in Android where they use a different type of framework, which is called SE Linux, or in the implementation on Android, SE Android. Again, it's basically the same idea, although it's a totally different take in the Apple's perspective. In Linux, what they do is they just use the kernel module to assign labels. In the iOS, macOS case, they still have a kernel module, they still have labels, but they do it a little bit differently. And so what they do is they have this framework, which is essentially a framework of callbacks from the kernel. Any type of operation, and virtually every system call in most traps, get this call out where they say, if there is some type of policy, then let us first run that operation by the policy, and the policy will decide yay or nay. Now, if the policy does abide, no problem. If the policy says no, we fail the operation. It's as simple as that. The policy in this case is actually sold separately. That's a kernel extension that is installed, and this is something that Apple could have made as a public kernel interface, what they call KPI. They chose not to. This is something that's not allowed for developers to interface with. Developers instead get a lesser, far inferior API, which is called KAuth, which isn't even coming close to the vast extent that MAC-F has. So Apple keeps MAC-F for themselves, and then basically what they do is they have their own kernel extensions, and those hooks basically decide yay or nay according to whatever the code there decides. And one important thing is that each such hook can basically just negate but not really approve. That is to say that if some other hook says no, then that's it. Suffice it that one hook says no, and that the operation should fail, and that's it. Nobody else can thwart that or somehow circumvent that and make that a negative into a positive. Now, in particular, what would it look like from a visual point of view? So we've got the user mode process. The user mode process is, of course, somewhere in userland. And in order to do anything of consequence, that user mode process has to issue a system call. Now, there is the notion of system calls and mark traps, which are two different things. But for the sake of simplicity, let's just assume system call as a cross from user mode onto the kernel boundary. Now, in the kernel mode, we've got a system call table or potentially the mock trap table, and those in turn will lead us to a vector, which is the actual call itself, the implementation. The corresponding call is called from the table, and in turn will call on that call out. They will do the call to the mandatory access control framework, which is the component that's built into the kernel, but then what's not built into the kernel is a set of policies. So MacF basically looks at a set of policies, which are registered modules, and calls out any of the so-called interested parties. Now, what are interested parties? Any module can register and assign a policy for up to about 400 and something operations. Naturally, not all of them care about all the operations, but depending on which operations you're interested in, you basically set your pointers. If the pointer is null, nobody's interested. If the pointer is not null, you get called. And so when you get called, you're one of those policy modules. And so MacF will call out to you and will say to you, do you want to approve, yay or nay? You get the option to choose, and you get the option to see all the arguments the same way the system call would, as well as you can see the kernel authorization structure, what they call KAuth, which is basically the user credentials, and it's very similar to the struct cred that people here in Android were talking about. Basically getting the UID, a GID, effective UID, and so forth. Now, the policy module itself may also call on a helper, and that's usually when they do an up call to a daemon. And you'll see that that's also what happens in our case too. Both the Amphi policy and the Sandbox policy have their separate daemons, although in iOS it's a little bit different nowadays. And in those cases, only if the daemon says to the kext, it's fine, then the kext will say to the MacF, it is fine. And then all this will propagate backwards to the system call implementation, and the system call may or may not succeed. But as far as MacF is considered, then that system call is allowed. Now, again, there may be more policy modules here. And the nice thing about it is that you can extend it in any way you want, or I should say in any way that Apple wants, which is unfortunately limited. But basically, this enables them to do any types of these policy modules. Sandbox is only one of these modules. And in fact, if you're looking at your macOS or if you're looking at your iOS, you're going to see several of those. The ones in iOS and macOS both are Amphi and Sandbox, but macOS itself also has Quarantine, which is the substrate for Gatekeeper, although that really doesn't work well. There's also something called MCX, which is the Managed Client Extensions. This is familiar if you've done any macOS in the enterprise, where you can manage applications, or if you've done parental controls, which is actually a pretty nifty feature inside macOS. And there's another one that's not really actively used, which is the so-called Time Machine Safety Net. But for our purposes, the main one is, of course, Sandbox. And just by looking at the number of operations here, you see that Sandbox gets the bulk of them. 130 operations, which correspond to most of the, I would say, useful system calls. Now, the idea is that you can decide whether a policy applies or not by spawning the executable. And when you spawn the executable, you usually do that via fork and exec or via POSIX spawn. In both cases, the implementation in kernel goes eventually into something called macexecve. And this macexecve is responsible for taking the binary and loading it. But before it does so, it'll also look at the label. And that label is basically a confine, whether or not we want to sandbox or do not want to sandbox. Now, this is where, up until now, everything is like the same. But from here, it's going to diverge, because the macOS perspective and the iOS perspective are actually, they're similar, obviously, but they're also profoundly different in the sense that macOS is primarily voluntary, and iOS, nobody's asking you. You're going to be in the sandbox whether or not you want to. So the original implementation actually conveys some of the name. The idea was to originally make it as an opt-in, and they called it seatbelt. Kind of like the seatbelt that you're supposed to buckle when you get in a car. But, you know, to be honest, many people don't like seatbelts, like not in the back seat or on the plane, you know, when they wake you up like 5 times on the 16-hour flight to tell you buckle your seatbelts. What I'm trying to do is sleep a little bit. So most people obviously cannot be relying on this seatbelt approach. And that's where you've got the macOS and iOS, which still are going to diverge here, but in the case of macOS, they're still going to give it semi-voluntary, is what I call. In the case of iOS, it's just going to be, with no questions, according to where you've been installed. So, voluntary you can still do, and that's usually calling Sandbox init. And that's if you're like a responsible application developer. Of course, application developers are not responsible. And so we've got the semi-voluntary, which is where Apple says, okay, you want to develop an app for macOS, no problem. You want to distribute it through the Mac App Store, no problem. But maybe there is a problem. We are going to do the code signing for you, and we are going to enforce that whatever goes in through the Mac App Store will actually be containerized. And they do that via an entitlement, which is something they control. Now, you can actually see that for yourself. If you've got any application that you've installed on your Mac, I use a tool called JTool, which is my own tool here. And just by looking at some random application like, say, I don't know, Evernote, which I've actually never actually used. I keep using it just as a demo, but I've never actually installed Evernote properly. You can see here that it's got a lot of entitlements, and one of these entitlements actually says here somewhere there's a COM Apple security app sandbox is true. Now, the interesting thing about this entitlement is that unlike other entitlements which tell you what you can do, for example, you can access the device camera, you can access the device microphone, this is where if you've got this, it's like the mark of Cain. You will be quarantined, you will be sandboxed, and there's nothing you can do about this. And that's because this entitlement was not provided by the Evernote developers. It was provided by Apple. And Apple, in the process of code signing this, in order to make this distributable through the App Store, has also slapped this entitlement, and therefore, that's it. As soon as you have this entitlement, you will be sandboxed in a process that I'll show you in a little bit. And then you've got the macOS case, sorry, the iOS case. And the iOS case is a little bit different in that they look at where you're installed. So Apple applications can still opt in to be sandboxed, but for the most part, most applications are going to be inside var mobile. And inside var mobile, there's going to be containers, where specifically you're looking at var mobile containers bundle, for example, data. And then you'll see here that there's all sorts of applications. And if you're actually installed in this location, the sandbox will effectively kick in. And you can actually do this with a nice little experiment, even on a jailbroken device. So let me just put this down. And observe that if I look, for example, here at this binary, okay, so this binary JTool runs here because it's running from an outside the sandbox location, from user local bin. But if I take the very same binary, which is, this user local, whatever it is, and I copy this to that quarantine directory, to essentially to var mobile, and over here I'll do containers, and I'll do bundle. So somewhere along the way in the path, there's going to be var mobile containers, data. Then somewhere along this path, if I try to run JTool from that location, then you can see, not here, not yet, but just I'll move it one more step further. As soon as it's in a bundled container, it will effectively be quarantined in this way. So let's just do this. It's kind of hard to do this with one hand. I'm going to try nonetheless. So I'll move this here. And so I'm putting this into, var bundle and what is it? Application, sorry. And so as soon as it's here, then you can see, hopefully, oh, not yet. Oh, I gave myself platform application, which is why it would work. Yeah, so JTool is not a good example because it is a platform application. But basically the idea, any other binary, if you try from whatever location, would actually be killed on the spot. Again, not a good example here, but you should have taken another binary. Now, in particular, how is that going to work inside macOS? So, in macOS, you do have containers, and the containers are slightly different than they would be in iOS, because in iOS, we've got this separate location, which we can, of course, use. But in macOS, everything gets installed into /applications. So instead of that, you've got your info plist. That info plist gives you your bundle identifier. And that bundle identifier, in turn, provides for you the identity of your app. Now, if you look at your apps, you should be able to see that there is a library directory in your home directory. And in this, there is a library containers. And those apps which are voluntarily sandboxed or otherwise sandboxed because of some restriction in the code signature will automatically have their own little directory here. Okay, so that's like the macOS implementation. And as of 10.75, which is like ages ago, they also put in this notion of group containers, which is apps that are developed by multiple apps by the same company or same entity can effectively share that container. Now, how is that really going to work? So we've got our app, and our app eventually, I mean, when it loads, it's going to have to, at some point, load libsystem. And it's going to load libsystem fairly soon because libsystem is the substrate or the fulcrum for all other APIs. So you have to have libsystem, and you cannot avoid this load. Libsystem's initializer is then going to call libdispatch, which is GCD. Now, whether or not you're using GCD is entirely irrelevant because that initializer gets called. This, in turn, goes and calls libsec_init. Now, again, this is all done at the DYLD stage, meaning you're being loaded and you don't have any ability to control this. This is well before your main even starts. And then your libsec_init is going to go through a couple of stages, which eventually is going to look if you have entitlements. And if you have entitlements, it's going to go and send this over an XPC pipe to another entity, which is not you, which is security-D. And that's what the message looks like. And you can see that it has, essentially, as any XPC message, it's had a dictionary with keys. And those keys are, where you can see over here, is a sandbox candidate. And in addition, there is the entitlement dictionary. Security-D is going to make the decision whether or not you should be quarantined. And if you should, it'll send a message, okay, let's quarantine you. Let's put you in a sandbox, that is. And then that, in turn, will go and put you into the sandbox. And this is why I said it's like semi-voluntary, because you don't really want to do that, but the initializers that you have no control over do, in fact, do that. Now, there are ways around this. There's definitely ways around this, but let's not discuss those because those constitute like basically vulnerabilities, and we're trying to stay clear of that. But I will show you just how you can show this for yourself. So LLDB, which is the built-in debugger if you've got Xcode, on virtually any app that you want. And let's just pick a random app that I know is going to be sandboxed. Probably one of the lesser used built-in apps. Let's use like, I don't know, chess. When's the last time anybody ever played chess on Mac OS? I don't know, but still. So looking at that, you'll see that it has its container required from app sandbox. Because it has that entitlement, it will be, in fact, containerized. And then let's do an LLDB on it. And as I do this LLDB right on that, I'm going to run this. But before running this, I'm going to put a breakpoint. And I'll put a breakpoint on XPC pipe routine. XPC pipe routine is how all of this XPC traffic is being carried over, where there's two forms. There's XPC messages, but the pipe gives you an implementation that's very much like a Unix pipe. So it's kind of like an emulation over XPC messages. I put in the XPC pipe routine like so, and then I run this. Now, as I run this, there's going to be several breakpoints. Not all of them are necessarily mine. The first one is actually for launchd. I can see which one it is by looking at the backtrace. This is not the right one. This is to uncork the XPC implementation, not what we want. So we continue. And the next one we see here is the one that's coming off from the XPC pipe create, which is coming from libsystem sec_init. So that's actually the one we want. Now, if we want to look at an XPC message, it all is a matter of just looking at wherever that message argument is. In this case, I can use a very handy XPC copy description, which is a little known but incredibly useful debugging that libxpc has. And I can say copy description, and I want here the first argument is the pipe, the second argument would be the message, so that would be RSI by the calling convention. And if you'll see here, this is actually a message. This is the initial handshake message. So let's continue past that. And looking here, you'll see that there's the exact message here, which says, this is my registration with sec_initd. And look here where it says that I'm, in fact, a candidate for the sandbox. That's a bool true, as well as my entitlements. And one of these entitlements in particular, in fact, is this one, which says security app sandbox is true. So as a corollary, it follows that I will, in fact, be sandbox. To actually see the sandbox, I need another breakpoint, which is going to be in the internal implementation of something called sandbox MS. And this is what they call the sandbox macf system call. Notice the double underscore, which actually here would be a triple underscore, and that's because they don't want you to, is it double underscore or triple? Yeah, there it is, double underscore, and that's because they don't want you to use this as a symbol. But then I continue, and as I continue, in fact, you'll see that in the backtrace, following the message from security-d, we have in fact set up an app sandbox for me. Now again, this is all before the main starts, and if you look here at the registers, you'll see that in fact the Mac syscall calls on the sandbox and says, I want operation number 0, which is basically shove me in a sandbox. And only then, after I press continue, will this actually finally load. There's a bunch of others, but then eventually this will, you know, take a while, but whatever, it'll load chess. Up until now, chess, or any other app for that matter, has no control over this at all. So this is all supposed to be safe because it happens before your main even starts. And I'm leaving it as an exercise to you to think how you could possibly circumvent that. I mean, certainly with a debugger you could have. You could just block the message. So that's the macOS case. And then that container that we're going to be put in is going to be in library containers, where all of your containers essentially look the same. And the way it works is we've got this, I'll push myself to that directory. So that would be my home directory and library and containers. And looking at that, you'll see that, again, there's all these bundles. I can actually go to ComApple Chess, or whichever one I want of ComApple, because they all have their own little containers like so. Irrespective of which container you choose, they all look the same, where there's a data directory and there's a container.plist. The container.plist, if you try to look at it, is not your average plist because it's very big. And because it's very big, it's also very binary. And so you want to convert this to normal code, which is normal XML. So you do plutil minus convert, and then you want to do XML1, which is the format, minus O minus to be std out, and another minus to be std in, and pipe more. And that gets you this nice little XML view, where you can see that it has the identity. And that's effectively your code signing identity. You ComApple Chess, but it's in Unicode, so it's encoded here as base64, followed by this very, very long sandbox profile data, which is in fact the confines of your container, which we'll get to very soon. After this, you'll see, following this data, which is really a huge blob, you have profile data validation info, and that again has those very same entitlements, as well as additional parameters which tell you which directories you're expected to be in, and more importantly, there's redirectable paths. Now, why are those redirectable paths interesting? Because Apple here is running into a problem. They want to give your app the sandboxing on the one hand, but also they want to give your app the ability to access various resources which are on your desktop, downloads, and so forth. So they use a rather novel approach, which is inside data, which is your quarantine directory, they actually have symbolic links. And this, of course, is nasty, because obviously symbolic links would imply traversals and whatnot, but that's why they have the redirectable passkey. They know which links are valid, and they actually check the targets of those links, so you can't simply do an ln-s and link yourself to elsewhere. So in that case, they've got things pretty well figured out in that case. Now, looking at iOS, iOS is a lot more stringent than that. So you're probably familiar with the classic model of iOS, which is var mobile applications, UUID of your app, and then inside, you've got the app name.app, whatever that is, and you've got the documents library and so forth, as well as StoreKit if you're doing any type of in-app purchases and iTunes and all that jazz. This has changed in iOS 8 and 9 to be in var mobile containers, which I've just shown you, where you've seen me do var mobile containers bundle, and then there's application, or there's var mobile containers data. Then if you're in those paths, you're automatically sandboxed. Now, why did they have to do this change? Because one of the things that iOS 8 at the time heralded is the ability to share data between related applications. And that's the same notion as they do like in macOS group containers, which is if you've got the same team identifier, the same code signature, and you're coming from effectively the same entity, they allow you to share data in between your apps. iOS 10 actually takes this another step further, and you can see that this has changed like significantly. And there's two notable changes. The first is in the structure, where no longer do we have this in just var mobile containers as before. Now we have var containers, which implies that we no longer rely on mobile, which is that UID of 501, which is what everything runs as. The other thing is there's ACLs, access control lists. And when I say here ACLs, I mean ACLs and then the extended attributes that you've got in Linux as well, setfacl, getfacl. And this actually is the clearest indication, at least in my humble opinion, that iOS is going to go multi-user. Because otherwise they wouldn't have to do this, and they would still keep everything in var mobile. So that's something that may not be out in iOS 10.0, but I believe that maybe in iOS 10.1 or something, it will eventually have to go multi-user, if only because the competition has as well. Now, looking at the actual containers, this means that we have to manage this vast directory structure in user mode. And that's why they have an additional daemon to do that. And that daemon is called Container Manager. The Container Manager daemon is the replacement, in some respect, to what the Sandbox daemon once was. The Sandbox daemon is still something that they have in macOS, but in iOS, no longer do we have that. And primarily, the main issue they were combating is that people would mess with the profiles. And it's rather easy to do that in user mode. And so now all the profiles are put into the KEX, the kernel extension itself. The Container Manager D now basically has its own private interface, and it exposes two ports. One is an XPC port, by means of which install-D, or mobile backup, can connect and set up containers when you install an app, or you restore an app, or you remove an app. The other is a Mach special port, and the Mach special ports we use primarily because we need to interface with the kernel, or in this case, the KEX. So all those up calls I mentioned are performed in this way, where there's Mach special port number 25, and there's one MIG message, one Mach interface generated message, which is effectively this special message, and then they use a proprietary, undocumented, of course, format called a SB packbuff, where they basically serialize all sorts of requests and replies. And that's an interesting topic in itself, but extends our scope. Now, one other player that we have here is Amphi, the so-called Apple Mobile File Integrity. And this is the arch nemesis of jailbreakers. This is the KEX and the daemon that make sure that there is no way you can effectively escape your confines, as well as, in the case of Amphi, run unsigned code. So Amphi and the Sandbox KEX, they work in very close communication with one another, where Amphi, not only does it kill processes and, you know, if anybody invalidates a code signature and such, it's responsible for that enforcement, but it also provides in-kernel services for entitlements. So if you want an entitlement inside the kernel, you generally go to Amphi. Amphi exposes a set of APIs for you, and then you say, give me the entitlement so-and-so. The Sandbox uses this primarily for one special entitlement, which is called seatbelt profiles. And seatbelt profiles are built in, again, as entitlements to Apple's own daemons. And that enables Apple to set or assign a particular policy for a daemon on a daemon-by-daemon basis. And again, because this is part of the code signature, the idea is that it has to be vetted by Apple, because we're under the assumption that an invalid code signature would have been killed by Amphi. Then there's another thing, which is Apple Private Security Container Required. And this is the same opt-in that you saw in the macOS case, only it's done on Apple's own applications. So for example, here, looking at jtool --ent, on applications, and pick one of Apple's built-in ones, which are, you know, mobile mail, mobile Safari, mobile whatever, and you'll see that there's a bunch of these, and there is this container required, which you should be able to see if I just do a grep. There it is, Apple Private Security Container Required. By virtue of this being in your code signature, you're automatically going to be containerized. Okay, so that's the way it's done there. So that's all in all the theory. Now, if you're looking at how one would approach reversing the Sandbox, so the Sandbox is a kernel extension, which means that in macOS, it's fairly easy to see because it's plain visible. So in macOS, it's a simple matter of going to your system library. And in system library, where all your kernel extensions are, you've got system library extensions. And then you're just looking at Sandbox KEX. And you'd be looking specifically at the contents, macOS, and that will give you the Sandbox KEX, which is for the most part pretty well symbolicated. So it's a simple matter of doing something like jtool -s, which is kind of like nm, and show me all those symbols. And you can see that you've got all the dependencies, but you've also got, if I'll do pipe more here, you've also got a lot of the internal symbols, which are the little lowercase t. Those internal are not exported, as well as a bunch that may be exported for other KEX. And for the most part, this is the main basis for all reversing, because the two are derived essentially from the same code base. Now, if you're looking at the iOS case, in iOS, all you have is one big kernel cache, which for the longest time was encrypted. And up until iOS 10, the only way to get access to that kernel was actually by first running an exploit that would give you arbitrary kernel memory read. And one of the read operations you do is just to dump the entire kernel. So you don't need to do that anymore, fortunately. And all it takes is basically getting the actual kernel cache, which you can get off any of the iOS IPSWEs or the OTA updates. That's very simple. And then there's a tool of mine, which is called Joker. And Joker, really, the sole raison d'etre of this tool is to analyze kernel caches. That's why I wrote it. And it's very, very useful, because then you can say, give me on a particular, for example, in iOS 10. So I think I have one or two here, iOS 10. And then you'd be looking at ZNU of whatever version. So ZNU's 3789. Or actually, let's make it the latest, which is 3789.2.2. And then it depends, of course, on which binary you're looking at, because there are different kernel implementations for different devices. But for the most part, running Joker like this will get you a list of the kext among many of its features. And when it gets you the list of the kext, you can also say, give me the actual kext, which is to do a minus uppercase K on com, Apple. And you have to give the bundle identifier of the kext, which in this case is security.sandbox. And if all goes well and it doesn't hideously crash, it'll tell you that it found it. And notice that it's also telling you that it's resolving the symbols. Now, some of the unable to resolve symbols here is because those are symbols from different kexts, which I do not support. That those are symbols coming from Amphi, and another dependent kext, which is called the regular expression matcher, which is applematch.kext. But for the most part, notice that it not only gave me the actual kext, which you can see in TMP as com, apple, security, whatever it is, but it also provided for me the companion file, which is this arm64.something something something. Now, the arm64 is just so you would know where you took it out of, but the .something something something is the UUID, which is the same UUID, and I'll show you here for a sec. It's the same UUID that you'll see here if you look at the kext itself. Every kext is uniquely marked with a UUID, and so that UUID over here matches that UUID that you could have seen over here. And that way you know that you're looking at the right file. And specifically, if you look further at that file, you'll see that it gives you all the symbols, which are the external dependencies, as well as, more importantly than that, all the policy options. Because remember that we've got the kexts that register policies, and these policies register callbacks, so that gives you all the callbacks. So that's a simple matter in itself. Once you know the structure of the kext, it becomes very, very easy, and there's a bunch of other tips here that I mentioned on how you can symbolic key the rest. But for the most part, I'm happy to announce that there's like 100% symbolication of this kext. Again, primarily built on top of the fact that the macOS kext really helps a lot. Now, if you're looking at the policy hooks themselves, this is where, by the way, if you want to look at it in real time, there's all the stuff I put on the associated web page, which, among other things, has this companion file. So looking at most of the hooks, and let's just do like a live one as an example, jtool -d, and let's look at the com whatever, pipe more. And so you can see that there is a bunch of functions here, and notice that this is all like being generated on the fly, like from the actual disassembly engine of jtool. And looking at one of those MPO policy options, for example, there's MPO policy init BSD, syscall, which we'll get to in a little bit. But let's look at one of the actual hooks. So for example, the hook for, I don't know, FCNTL. So that hook for FCNTL is over here, and you can see it says MPO file check FCNTL. And I chose FCNTL just out of random chance, but basically you can pick any one of those. In the case of FCNTL, the first thing it's doing is it's comparing one of the arguments of FCNTL to see if this is an approved FCNTL, in which case it just short circuits and just doesn't do anything, it jumps to the end. Or you can see in other cases it needs to call evaluate. And how does it do the evaluate? It passes a buffer, which is a 224 byte 0 buffer here, to cred SB evaluate. Now in cred SB evaluate, notice we've got like 3 arguments. One of them is the actual policy supplied argument, which is this arg0. The second argument is here, but the middle argument here is 7b.
And that 7b is an operation number. So operation numbers, and you can see, like, if I look at check mmap, then again, we're looking at the same credSB evaluate, but this time the number is D. If I'm looking at file check set, it's the same structure, but now it's 79. In other words, those numbers basically encode operations. And so we've got all these operations. This in turn goes to credSB evaluate. Where am I? There it is. Yeah. And in credSB evaluate, you're basically looking at the actual operation number that keeps on going through that to SB evaluate. And then what SB evaluate does is it calls eval. So just to show you how I generated this, the idea is to do here, once I know the name of the function, I can actually disassemble the particular function by just saying SB evaluate like so. And if I do so, it'll just give me all the output of the function like so. But what I really want is just to see the callouts. So I would do a grep to isolate only those callouts, which is BL for ARM64 branch and link. And that gives me exactly the general flow of callouts. Now, mind you, this doesn't have some of the logic inside and if then else's, but for the most part, it's a very simple way that I use a lot in order to see the flow. If you use IDA, IDA has the xref feature, but they don't really have a callout feature, which sometimes is actually more important. So you can see for the most part, it's part of doing this eval, and eval is the main bulk that does a lot of the actual profiles. Now, what are these profiles? So profiles are something that you can still find in macOS in their plain text form. And that plain text is actually, well, it's not so plain text. It's not so readable because it's written in this horrid language called Tiny Scheme. If you look at that, you'll see that there's a directory which is system, library, sandbox, and profiles, like so. And there's a bunch of these SB files here. Now, again, I'm warning you that this is like probably the worst type of syntax I've ever seen. This is something when I took Scheme as an undergrad, I vowed I'd never, ever mess with it again. But yeah, there it is. It comes to haunt me. And so the idea is basically it's a very simple language in practice where it shows you allow, deny, the operation, and then the arguments of the operations, which you can see are for the most part literals. And there's also a very convoluted case of regular expressions which are being used here, but I'm not going to get into that. One thing, though, that is interesting is that these profiles may then be compiled, and they may also be traced. And in order to do that, you've got a tool called Sandbox exec. Sandbox exec is a very simple binary that Apple keeps closed source, and it's an actual dishonest binary in the sense that it has a lot more options than it would tell you about. One of the main options is an undocumented -t, which is for tracing. And this is actually very, very useful because then you can take this and apply and effectively get a trace on any type of binary that you want. Now, there's two ways of doing that. One is to specify a trace profile like so, which is this simple profile that basically allows everything, but just says, I also want you to trace into a file. And then the other one is to just do this -t thing to Sandbox exec, which basically uses a different set of undocumented APIs to perform the tracing. Why that's important is because it gives you a pretty good idea of what the app is trying to do while still allowing this. So think about SE Linux in permissive mode, where permissive mode it still allows, but it will complain about things that, you know, what it's trying to do on any given process like that. I'm also happy to report that if you look at the actual website, you'll see that there is the source of Sandbox exec, which I've basically just re-engineered from the assembly. And now it's fully compatible, and more important than compatible is the fact that you can now compile it for the first time for iOS. Now, I should point out again that some of the functionality in iOS is a little bit broken. Excuse me, tracing doesn't really work without Sandbox D, but you can probably work around that too if you bring back an older version of Sandbox D, and that's actually a very, very powerful tool. The main thing about it is that you can say Sandbox exec and specify a profile, and apply the profile automatically, and then effectively try to see what your application would do if it's sandboxed or if it's not sandboxed. Now, in iOS, most of the profiles are going to be built in, and like I said, they're built into the Kext itself. macOS originally had 4 of these. In iOS, there's like honestly dozens and dozens still. You can find them. You can also reverse engineer and you can decompile them. The decompilation is actually something that's shrouded in mystery because there have been attempts at providing a good decompiler. None of the actual decompilers actually work properly. There's a bunch of Python scripts that are purport to do that. They're not really that effective. And also, the Sandbox profile language keeps on changing in the actual compiled implementation. Now, as for what this would look like on iOS, because all of this was, the macOS implementation we've seen. In iOS, the main hook is the cred label update execve, which is basically the callback that occurs when you call an execve. So this calls back into Sandbox Kext. Sandbox Kext will then call an Amphi. It'll look in Amphi to see if there's a particular seatbelt profile that you have. Because if you do, then that seatbelt profile will apply to you automatically. If you don't, it'll go and try and containerize you as any third-party app. Then, there is a call to something called PE-IconHasDebugger, and this is not my invention of a name. This is the actual built-in name by Apple, which is something that they use to pass as a boot argument. As of iOS 5, you can't really pass boot arguments, so you can't really get that debugger ability, unless in some jailbreaks you can actually patch that, but not anymore, not in recent ones. Then you get the signing identifier. And that's the entitlement of application identifier, which again is provided by Apple. Then you get container required, which you saw already in the built-in Apple apps. So that's how we know, either by application identifier or by container required, that we need to sandbox you. Then we check the sandbox spawn adders, which is where user mode can actually say, I want to start you with a particular configuration. Most of the check here is just to make sure that nobody's trying anything hanky-panky, because obviously these spawn adders will dictate what the sandbox behavior would be. Following that, there's an upcall as of iOS 9 to Container Manager. Container Manager is going to specify the path where your app is installed and where the data container is, because the data container and the actual program container are not the same. Once we get that, we validate the container name. We call on a built-in sandbox create function, which basically assigns us a default profile for all third-party apps. We set the container. We create an extension, which is kind of like a special rule that says, oh, that executable that's outside the container, we can still access it. We also create the actual sandbox object, and we assign it on your kauth structure, which means that any subsequent call by the same PID, we can always get that sandbox. And last but definitely not least, we revoke all the privilege ports. We do not want to have access to any Mach or XPC ports which are special. In particular, we're talking about Mach special ports here, such as the Bootstrap port and such others, because if you have those, you get XPC or RPC in general visibility, which in turn could allow you to break out of the sandbox by exploiting some other daemon. So if all goes well, that's basically what happens to all of your apps. If something is awry and something doesn't seem right, the sandbox kills you on the spot. They basically deny the operation, and you automatically get a kill -9. Again, this is all before you execute code, because this is on the hook to execve. So they're basically guaranteeing that no malicious code or potentially jailbreaking able code would run. Okay, and of course, the ways to get past that are, of course, in the very long lore of how one would jailbreak. Now, as for the APIs, Sandbox has a bunch of APIs which Apple keeps private. Some of them have been reversed, some of these have not been known up until the present day. So basically, the APIs are, you can say, they're in two groups. The first is libsystem sandbox. And that's primarily the calls to the kext, to the kernel extension, which are wrapped by very simple wrappers so that they're easily and readily available via C APIs. Then there's userlib, libsandbox.1.dilib, which effectively handles most of the profile compilation. And the good news about profiles is we may not be able to decompile them properly, but we are able to compile them on the fly. So a lot of the reversing I do is to basically try and compile, keep changing a little bit of the profile, and then see what the actual change in the binary profile would be. Now, in terms of how to interface with a kext, that would be over Mac syscall. This is a proprietary Apple syscall, which is actually modeled after the same syscall in BSD, but is implemented differently. So that's syscall number 381, and it's basically an ioctl style. And the ioctl style here is this idea that it gives you a set of numbers, and each number provides some different functionality. And the first argument before that even is the name of the kext you want to interface with. So you can say sandbox to get to sandbox, you can say quarantine in macOS to get to quarantine, and so forth and so forth. Looking at that, you can see a list of these APIs, but I should point out that these APIs have in fact been constantly changing. A better list you can see if you're looking at the actual output of the, if you're looking here at, for example, my text. So the text that I provided for you is fully symbolicated. That makes it really easy. But even if it weren't symbolicated, what you want to look at is the hook of the policy syscall, which is somewhere here. There it is. MPO policy init. No, it's one after. It's, give me a second here. Yeah, there it is. Platform policy syscall. Yeah, there it is. Okay, so you're looking at MPO policy syscall, and you can see that over here there's a switch statement. And it's very easy to identify switches in ARM64 code because you've got the LDR-SW, which basically takes the value of x10, which in this case is this, and there's a huge switch statement which basically handles all the cases. If you look further with the JTool output, you'll see that all these cases are broken for you. A lot of them are unimplemented or forbidden for, being obviously too dangerous in iOS. But for the most part, there's quite a few that are implemented. For example, you can see syscall inspect, or you can see note, or you can see check, which are primarily the APIs that work both in macOS and in iOS. So looking at Sandbox check, this is one of those that have been fully reversed and people know about. That is probably the best way that you can find out if a certain sandboxed operation is allowed or not allowed without the potential of, untimely demise if the sandbox kills you. And primarily how you do that is you can check on any PID that you want. That's pretty useful. It's part of a set of APIs that Apple would use that, given a PID, it would either check if they're code signed or if, for example, in this case, if a sandbox operation is allowed. This is, in my humble opinion, the best way to establish the boundaries of a given profile. And in order to do that, I wrote a simple tool, which is available for your download as open source. And since I'm here in an open iOS session, allow me to just demonstrate. The tool is simply called SBTool. And it takes in a PID, and then you tell it what you want to do. Now, some PIDs are actually unsandboxed. If you're going to be on a jailbroken device yourself, you're not sandboxed. In which case, the tool says, meh, it's moot. I mean, forget it. I'm not going to check anything. But again, looking at, I don't know, for example, a mobile mail or mobile Safari or any of the mobiles, those are actually quarantined inside, the implementation by Apple security container required. And so you can say SBTool, and you can say the PID 551, and then you can basically say you want to check. Now, what can you check? You can do all, which actually doesn't work so well yet. I'm still working on that. But you can say, give me all the Mach ports. And this is going to spit out a list of all the Mach ports with the simple yep or nope. Now, the way it works is you can actually grep it and see which ports are allowed, like so, or which ports are not allowed. And that is the best way that I can think of finding the attack surface. The other thing you can do is you can say access to a particular file or directory. So you can say, for example, file. Of course, this would mean you have to specify the file or directory name, TMP, and it says, no, you're restricted. Or it could say that you're allowed. So this is all done by Sandbox check. The way I get the XPC service is actually through a proprietary interface that I call liblaunched, where I query launched, I get all the XPC services, and then just basically brute force, which again is common practice when you're looking at PIDs. Now, the other thing, which is a real gem, is called Sandbox Inspect. What does Sandbox Inspect do? It actually tells the sandbox, give me all the information you got. So all it takes is to put in this inspect, and you can see that it's giving you a full explanation of what the sandbox profile is from the perspective of the sandbox itself. So you can see the size of the profile, the associated container, and then you've got various extensions. And those extensions are the rules that were provided in order to allow mobile mail to do what it needs to do, which wouldn't really fit in any hard-coded profile. So that's basically this very simple idea. Again, SBTool with the inspect argument. And those extensions are, they're a universe in themselves. But to keep the long story short, you can think of it this way. Most iOS applications will get 3 standard extensions. They're Apple Sandbox Executable, Container, and Application Group. Of course, to show you this, I'll have to look at some application, which is fairly easy because they're all in the same bundles there. So looking, for example, actually I'm looking at IHG Priority Club, because now we're in an IHG property, I guess. And so 934. And you can see that this is a third party, and because it's a third party, it gets those extensions, which is to say it can access its own application bundle, and it can access its own container like so. Okay, but then if you looked at originally the inspection of mobile mail, Apple obviously gives itself more extensions, which also have to do, for example, with access to your photos and access to your address book, which will be on Sandbox, because mobile mail needs to do that, and it doesn't need to go through TCC, which is the transparency, consent, and control that gives you all those annoying pop-ups. Now, the actual full list of extensions is here, and you can see that there's all of these, and there's also an API for the extensions, which you can see, which is based out of libsandbox. The actual implementations of extensions is a little bit more complicated than that. Primarily, there's a token, and then there's this very interesting SHA-1 that they use inside off of a Sandbox Sentinel, which I'm not going to get into that, because we are running out of time anyways. But I will tell you a couple of things. First of all, if anything of this is like relevant to you as if you're like Mac OS developers or iOS developers, this is something that you have to deal with, because it is in fact a reality in iOS, and it's coming very, very soon to Mac OS as well, especially with the advent of SIP. Apple is just tightening further and further the restrictions of the sandbox. What they do is they gently float it around to see if there's any issues, if anybody raises any concerns, and if nobody does, they just tighten it further still. So it's kind of like a noose that's slowly closing in on developer freedom, essentially. But then you've got all these tools, and I really hope that this will, reinvigorate the whole interest in the sandbox, especially after Dionysus's great article, which I think is relevant today as it was 5 years ago, which you should totally go ahead and get. And of course, you've got all these tools, and they're all out there. Also, what you've been seeing here is effectively an excerpt from the upcoming book, which is macOS, the second edition, macOS and iOS internals. And this is actually coming out in volume 3 first. There's 3 volumes, 1, 2, and 3. 1 is user mode, 2 is kernel mode, and 3 is the security and insecurity. And what I've basically tried to do is summarize an entire 30, 40-page chapter into this hour-long presentation. So I hope that was instructive. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to take them. Any questions? Offstage is good. Yeah, we start.
It's good timing as well, because then we're having a coffee break after this. So if you have questions, feel free to approach him during coffee breaks. Excellent. Thank you very much, Jonathan.